The rain came down in sheets, a solid curtain of gray water that turned the jungle into a quagmire. For the men of SEAL Team 3, it was just another Tuesday. They moved through the oppressive humidity like wraiths, their progress marked only by the soft squelch of their boots in the mud and the rhythmic, heavy breathing muffled by their night vision goggles. Their objective was a sleepy little village, a suspected waypoint for a high-value target moving weapons across the border. It was supposed to be a snatch and grab, a quick in and out before first light. Silence was their only ally. The team's chief medic, a man named Marcus, whose hands were steadier than a surgeon's, was on point with his squad leader, Lieutenant Reynolds. They'd been in country for 6 weeks, and the tension was a living thing coiled in their guts. Every shadow could be a muzzle flash, every sound a tripwire. They had trained for years for this, in their bodies and minds honed into instruments of war. Yet despite the discipline, there was a familiar, bitter tang of adrenaline in Marcus's mouth. It was the taste of a world where one wrong step could unravel everything. As they approached the village's perimeter, a cluster of mud brick huts huddled around a dusty courtyard, the rain began to ease. The silence that followed was even more profound, broken only by the distant drip of water from the canopy. Reynolds gave the hand signal, and the team fanned out, ghosting between the buildings. They were a machine of 10 men, each a specialized part, moving in perfect lethal sync. Marcus stayed close to Reynolds, his medical kit a familiar weight on his back, a stark contrast to the lethal M4 in his hands. He hoped, as he always did, that the kit would remain unopened. They cleared the first 2 huts without incident. The occupants, a family of farmers, were terrified but compliant, but huddling together as a SEAL secured them with plastic zip ties. This was the ugly part of the job, the part that sat heavy in Marcus's gut. They weren't the enemy, just people caught in the gears of a war they didn't ask for. He pushed the thought aside. Focus. That was the key. Compartmentalize. The mission was all that mattered. The third hut was different. It was larger than the others, set slightly apart. As the team approached, a dog barked, a yapping sound that shattered the quiet. The element of surprise was gone. Reynolds swore softly into the comms, a single sharp word. The game had changed. They had to move fast now. The lead element stacked up against the wooden door. With a brutal, efficient kick, it splintered inward. The team flooded in, a wave of camouflage and carbon fiber, their weapon-mounted lights cutting swathes through the darkness, turning the interior into a tableau of frozen fear. "Clear! Clear! Moving!" The command was a low, urgent whisper over the radio. Inside the hut was a single room. A kerosene lamp lay knocked over, its flame extinguished. A rough-spun blanket served as a partition in the corner. The team's lights swept past an old woman cowering on a mat. A young man with wide, terrified eyes pressed against the far wall. Then the blanket moved. A figure burst from behind it, a dark shape against the deeper dark. It was a blur of motion, heading straight for a back window. And the team's reaction was instantaneous, a product of thousands of hours of reflexive training. A SEAL named Jones, a mountain of a man from Montana, lunged. He didn't fire. The ROE were clear. Suspected combatants, not confirmed hostiles. His massive arm wrapped around the figure, tackling it to the hard-packed earth floor with a bone-jarring thud. There was a sickening crack as the figure's head struck the corner of a low wooden stool. The struggle was over in a second. The figure went limp. Contact! Man down! Jones's voice was a sharp, urgent hiss. Marcus was already moving, his medical instincts overriding everything else. He slid across the dirt floor, shrugging off his rifle, his world narrowing to the body crumpled in the corner. The rest of the team fanned out, securing the room, their muzzles scanning the doors and windows, their backs to their medic. They were his shield. As Marcus knelt, his hands went automatically to the figure's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. And the skin he touched was smooth, unblemished by stubble, and the neck was slender. A cold, sharp shock ran through him. He pulled the dark knit cap from the figure's head, and a cascade of long, matted black hair spilled out, sticking to the blood that was beginning to pool on the floor. It was a woman. For a single, suspended second, time seemed to stop. The only sound was the rain starting up again on the tin roof, a frantic drumming that matched the sudden, erratic thumping in Marcus's chest. He looked up, his face illuminated by the harsh light of a teammate's weapon. Reynolds met his gaze, and in the lieutenant's eyes, Marcus saw the same jolt of horrific realization. The room, which had been a cacophony of controlled chaos, fell utterly silent. Every SEAL stilled, their breathing shallow, their focus shifting from the external threat to the internal crisis happening at their feet. The rules of engagement, the mission parameters, the very understanding of who the enemy was had just been shattered. The silence in the hut was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. It pressed in on Marcus as his fingers finally found a weak, thready pulse at the woman's neck. She was alive, but for how long? The blood was a shocking scarlet against the dark dirt floor, spreading with a terrifying speed. He tore his gaze away from her face, forcing his mind to click back into the cold, calculated logic of a medic. Triage, assess, treat. He couldn't afford the distraction of her being a woman. She was a casualty. That was the only box he could put her in right now. He ripped open her simple cotton tunic, exposing her torso to the dim light. The sight that greeted him made his stomach clench. This was no innocent villager. Her body was a roadmap of conflict. A long, puckered scar ran along her ribs, a souvenir from a knife fight or shrapnel. Another, a perfect circle, marked her shoulder. An old gunshot wound. An exit and entry. And there, strapped to her thigh beneath a layer of loose-fitting pants, was a holster with a heavy, chrome-plated pistol. She was a combatant. A fighter. The realization didn't make treating her any easier. It just complicated the torrent of emotions he had to dam behind a wall of professional detachment. "Marcus, talk to me." Reynolds's voice was low, controlled, but Marcus could hear the tension coiled within it. The LT was responsible for this op, for these men. And a dead woman, especially one who might be a fighter, was a whole new level of complication. It meant paperwork, investigations, and questions back home that no one wanted to answer. Subdural hematoma, for sure, Marcus muttered, his voice tight as he gently probed the matted, bloody hair on the side of her skull. The bone felt unstable beneath his fingertips. Skull fracture, depressed, she's bleeding inside her brain. Pupils are unequal. He shone a small penlight into her eyes. The left was a pinpoint, the right was dilated and fixed. Brain's being compressed. We have maybe minutes before she herniates. She needs a neurosurgeon, LT, not a field medic in a mud hut. The words hung in the air, an impossible sentence. They were hours from a real field hospital, days from a neurosurgeon. The mission's extraction window was still 30 minutes out. There was no way a medevac could get here in time, not in this weather, not in this hostile territory. "Well, what about the local clinic?" Jones offered, his voice small, the guilt of the tackle already etching deep lines in his face. "With what? A bottle of aspirin and a sewing kit?" Marcus snapped, then immediately regretted it. It wasn't Jones's fault. It was no one's fault. It was the ugly, chaotic math of war. He took a deep breath, his training reasserting itself. "I need to relieve the pressure. Now, or she dies right here." He looked at Reynolds, a silent question in his eyes. And doing nothing meant she died. Trying to save her meant a field procedure so risky, so barbaric, that it could kill her just as easily. But it was the only chance. Reynolds gave a single curt nod. It was all the permission Marcus needed. Johnson, get me more light. Torres, hold her head steady. Don't let her move. His orders were crisp, cutting through the lingering stupor. The team snapped to, their training overriding their shock. One man held a chemical light stick near the wound. Another steadied the woman's shoulders. Jones, unable to do anything else, stood guard at the broken door, his massive frame blocking the entrance. Marcus's world shrank to a space the size of a dinner plate. He pulled out his medical kit, the contents suddenly looking pathetically inadequate. This was a procedure he had only read about in textbooks, seen in training videos. He had a scalpel, a manual suction bulb, and his own steady hands. It would have to be enough. He swabbed the area with an alcohol wipe, the sharp, clean scent a bizarre contrast to the earthy smell of blood and damp. He said a quick, silent prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. Okay, he breathed, more to himself than anyone else. Here we go. With the precision of a safecracker, he made the first incision. The scalpel blade, razor-sharp, parted the skin of her scalp. It was a strange sensation, cutting into living flesh with the intent to save. There was no resistance. Just a clean parting of tissue. More blood welled up, dark and venous. He used the suction bulb to clear it away, his movements deliberate and controlled. The others watched in a grim, fascinated silence. The only sounds were the rain, the woman's shallow, irregular breathing, and the soft, wet sounds of Marcus's work. He had to drill a burr hole, a small opening in the skull to let the trapped blood escape. He didn't have a medical drill. What he had was a manual cranial drill, a brutal, hand-cranked tool that looked like it belonged in a medieval torture chamber. He positioned the pointed tip on the bone, just above where he estimated the bleed to be. He looked at Torres, who was holding the woman's head. Torres, a man who had seen countless horrors, looked pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Hold her tight," Marcus instructed. "This is going to be unpleasant." He began to turn the handle. The sound it made was sickening, a low, grinding crunch as the metal bit into the living bone. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire hut, through the soles of his boots, up into his own skull. The woman's body jerked, a reflexive spasm, but Torres held firm. Marcus kept turning, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Sweat dripped from his nose, mixing with the blood on the woman's skin. Grind, turn, crunch. The sound was relentless, a physical assault on everyone present. He could feel the eyes of his teammates on him, their silent support a palpable force. They were his brothers, and in this moment, they were holding him up as much as they were holding her down. Finally, with a last, sickening pop, the bit broke through the inner table of the skull. Marcus quickly reversed the drill and withdrew it. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then a thick, dark slurry of blood, like crankcase oil, began to ooze from the small, perfectly round hole. It was the decompression he had been praying for. He used the suction bulb to gently draw more out, watching as the pressure that was killing her slowly, miraculously, began to ease. He gently packed the wound with sterile gauze, his hands finally still. He sat back on his heels, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and a profound, overwhelming relief. He looked at the woman's face. It was still, peaceful even, in the harsh light. Her breathing, he noticed, was already deeper, more regular. He checked her pupils again. The dilated one had constricted slightly. It wasn't a cure. It was a desperate Hail Mary play that had, against all odds, bought her a few more hours. A chance. He looked up at Reynolds. The lieutenant's face was unreadable. The mission was blown. They had a critically wounded, unconscious female combatant on their hands.